So let me dive in and open with some comments on the concept of a learning healthcare system or a learning healthcare delivery system. And for those of you familiar with the literature and the work that the IOM has done, I make a very clear and strong and, in my mind, important distinction between a learning health system, which is what we think of as a societal level a system where we are continuously trying to learn and study and provide feedback and improve, versus a learning healthcare delivery system, which I think of as an integrated delivery system such as Kaiser, such as VA, Intermountain, and many of our academic health systems now are becoming integrated Kaiser-like or Intermountain-like. And what it is to be a healthcare delivery system that is learning, high performing. And it's that concept that I'll focus on during at least the first half or two-thirds of my talk this afternoon. What I'd like to do is spend a bit of time talking briefly through what the goals are, what the outcomes and expected performance goals are of a learning healthcare delivery system, and then talk about what their features are and what kinds of performance processes are involved. And in some ways move towards something that we're discussing very actively now at Kaiser, and that is the need for some sort of handbook to the design and operation of a learning healthcare delivery system. And that handbook itself requires that we understand what are the features, what are the desired characteristics, the kinds of organizational units and programs and initiatives and staffing and capabilities that need to be contained. And so I'll talk a bit about that and then discuss how implementation science relates to these goals. So when we look to try to understand what are the goals of a learning healthcare delivery system, I'll walk you through 2 or 3 slides very briefly, won't go into much detail. But the Crossing Quality Chasm report a good 15 years ago at this point identified the desired features of a high-performing, high-quality health system. So this is what our systems, our integrated delivery systems, should aspire to do or to be, to provide care that's safe, effective, and so on. Another source of guidance is the Commonwealth Fund's framework for a high-performance health system, its commission that was established 5 years after the IOM report came out. And just within, I believe, the last 2 or 3 years, this commission was closed. But at the time that it was launched, it too published a set of documents that laid out the desirable features of and outcomes or effects of a high-performing healthcare system. Again, focusing on issues like quality and safety, access to care. They talked about efficiency and high volume in care, and also system capacity to improve. And when you look through this list, and if I had gone through it a bit more slowly and you'd had a chance to look at each of the individual items, you would see that it's this last list that gets a little bit closer to the characteristics of the system, not just what should the system try to produce or what kind of care and quality should we see as far as its outputs, but what are the features of that system? What do we need to think about if we're designing or trying to convert our healthcare delivery system to a high-performing, high-quality learning healthcare system? So the features and the outcomes are listed right here. Again, and this is a combination of the 2 lists that I've just provided. And the question again is, how do we achieve these goals? What is it we need to include in our blueprint, in the organizational design, in the standard operating procedures, the policies and procedures of a learning healthcare delivery system? I think it's fair to say that that system should begin with explicit performance goals, improvement and learning goals. So the system and its leaders, its managers, have to know what it is they're trying to achieve, and those should be stated very explicitly and very clearly in a high level of detail. We should have comprehensive performance monitoring. So it's not enough to just say, this is what we strive to do. We strive to have this number of days of healthy living, these rates of improvement or these rates of performance in terms of delivering necessary care, meeting our prevention targets and so on. We need to have performance monitoring against those goals. And some of these concepts come from basic management literature. There are principles of the design and management of organizations that begin with the fact that an organization has to have a strategy, has to have a set of goals, it has to have mechanisms in place to monitor its performance relative to those goals. The next feature of a high-performing learning healthcare delivery system is the concept or the philosophy that its care be based not on the individual autonomous judgments of the clinicians within that system, but that it be guided by, in part, explicit care management plans, policies, practices. So there need to be explicit protocols and policies and blueprints in place that tell us how should we deliver care in a way that will allow us to meet our performance goals, and where the performance monitoring that's tracking our performance will show that we are in fact high performing. We also need these systems to include active environmental scanning. They need to be not closed systems focusing only on care within, but always watching for new findings, new innovations, new opportunities to learn, new ideas that they can import and implement in order to continually improve. So when you think about the issue of organization design, what kinds of units, departments, capacities, skills are needed? Having an organizational unit or program that is dedicated to scanning the environment, looking for new research findings, looking for new opportunities, new innovations. That would be part of the blueprint for a high-performing learning healthcare delivery system. Policies that guide that environmental scanning for locating, for vetting and evaluating, and perhaps equally importantly, refining those innovations so that they work within our system. Again, this is a set of capabilities, capacities that need to be included within the organization. Similarly, for internal innovation, not all of the answers to poor performance, not all of the opportunities to improve come from outside. The system has to have its own internal structures and resources and policies and procedures that allow it to innovate, but also allow it to innovate with a purpose. The medical director for quality in Kaiser Southern California, Michael Cantor, likes to comment on the fact that within KP Southern California, he's never encountered an innovation that's not successful. Just ask the champions and they'll tell you. We have a situation where the innovations that are implemented are not, and this is not just my own system that I'm criticizing, this is true of all systems, and in some ways I would argue that we may be a little bit better than the average, but by and large health systems do not have formal structures and programs in place that allow them to experiment in a guided, managed way, where we try ideas, we evaluate them, we work to improve them if they're not quite achieving their goals. If they're not achieving their goals and they can't be refined and strengthened, then we need to try something else, as opposed to what we tend to do, which is to allow those ideas to continue. So on the one hand, we have a volume of innovation activity without much management, where we see the persistence of bad ideas in some cases, or ideas that are not strengthened and improved in a way that they could. But we also have the opposite problem, where within that experimentation, when there are successful ideas that are effective, we don't take steps to scale and spread them. Because again, it's not a managed activity. So for both the external environmental scanning as well as internal innovation, doing a much better job of managing that innovation process so that we reap the benefits, so that we ensure that we strengthen ideas that are weak or eliminate those that are not succeeding. This is part of what we need in our learning healthcare delivery systems. And obviously leadership, culture that's supportive, we need the training and resources, space and so on. So this is the beginnings, I would argue, of a list of requirements for developing and managing a learning healthcare delivery system. So what is the role of improvement science, implementation science, delivery system science within a learning healthcare delivery system? And when we think about the role of research in general, we can think about at least these four different kinds of contributions and perhaps many more. One of them comes directly from our colleagues in the clinical research field, those who do drug trials and trials of devices. The goal of clinical research focused on drugs and devices is to develop and identify through research highly effective, reliable strategies, interventions, drugs, devices, and so on for achieving desired outcomes. And we could think about that mindset and apply it to healthcare delivery, implementation, improvement strategies. Perhaps the role that we in these fields have is to try to identify methods like computerized reminders or academic detailing or others that we can show to be effective under various circumstances and add them to what would essentially be a list of evidence-based care management interventions. So that's at least one way to envision the role of the implementation improvement sciences. And in a few minutes I'll come back and talk about why I believe that that's not a realistic role, that the kinds of interventions that we study don't have the same stable properties that drugs and devices do, and that we never will achieve a situation where we have a list of effective implementation strategies that we can draw from and use as part of the equivalent of an FDA-approved list or formulary list of interventions. So if you agree that the field perhaps should not be striving to develop this list of effective intervention strategies, maybe the goal instead is for us to develop a set of effective strategies for how to go about improving care. So if the situation is one where we don't have a short list of strategies that we can pull off a list, but every strategy, every implementation program or improvement program perhaps needs to be designed in a customized manner, maybe we need some organized methods and approaches for going about developing those and testing and refining them. In approaches such as PDSA, rapid cycle improvement, various approaches for analyzing and monitoring performance, those are perhaps part of this toolkit of strategies for guiding our improvement activity. A very different role for research is not to focus on the so-called intervention end, strategies to achieve change, but instead to focus on developing a better understanding of the systems and the problems that we're trying to address. So we could task the research field with developing much better insights into the behaviors of organizations and delivery systems. That's what I've listed at the end. Or number three, insights into barriers to change. So what are the problems that prevent us from achieving higher performance? If we could understand and identify those root causes, then perhaps those who are charged with addressing and overcoming the causes of safety and quality problems might have the ability to succeed the greater insights. So again, these are four different kinds of roles or purposes for implementation improvement science, and they all have very different implications for us within the field and what it is that we are trying to achieve and how it is that we aim to contribute to higher performing healthcare systems. So one of the fields that I've mentioned, and this is at least one of the shifts that I'll make in the talk from concepts of learning health system to implementation science, which I know is in part what Carrie had asked me to speak about. Implementation science is one of the fields that is focused on these kinds of goals, these kinds of problems. And the question that many have is, what is implementation science? In many cases, researchers within health systems and medical schools, nursing schools, and other programs have heard about the field. It sounds interesting, but they're not quite sure what it is. So what I'd like to do in perhaps 4 or 5 slides is provide at least a basic overview of implementation science and what its key goals are. So this sort of 4-chapter story is one illustration of what we typically think of when we think about quality improvement, research improvement science, and implementation science. It begins with the development of new clinical evidence or a new innovation, a new drug that's found to be effective, or a new indication for a drug, a new healthcare delivery strategy that's effective. When that drug is first announced, approved, or the large RCT, the definitive RCT findings are released, we typically see some initial efforts to promote adoption, promote implementation. Those usually take the form of press releases, perhaps an editorial that would accompany the publication of the trial. In some cases, there are health systems that will send around internal memos and notices to try to inform the medical community, the health systems of this new evidence, and of course encourage them to adopt it where appropriate. What tends to happen, of course, as you all know, is when we go back 3, 5, 7, 8 years later to examine rates of utilization of the drug in question before and after the new study was published documenting its much higher level of effectiveness than was previously known to be the case, where we of course would expect to see a significant change in rates of utilization. Most of the studies here in this 3rd chapter of the story tend to show little or no change. We know that the health system, the medical profession, and others are very conservative, very resistant to change, in many cases appropriately. When we talk to practicing clinicians about the latest study coming from an academic center showing that drug X is effective and asking them why they haven't started to use it more often, their response oftentimes is, well, come back to me in 6 months after the results of the next so-called definitive trial have been conducted, showing that the drug is not so effective, and then we can talk about why I'm not jumping to change my practice. So we know, again, that the health system is very conservative, and this is why when we see chapters 1 and 2, new research, new findings, new evidence, or new innovations introduced, it takes the proverbial 17 years before we begin to see some adoption, some uptake. So these 3 chapters in this phenomenon of low rates of adoption, slow rates of adoption, is what leads to what we generally think of when we hear implementation research. And that is item 4, research that develops and evaluates specific practice change strategies, quality improvement methods, implementation strategies. They're practice change efforts focused on clinicians, focused on healthcare delivery systems, and other targets that aim to accelerate the adoption of new evidence. The IOM Clinical Research Roundtable and then the NIH Roadmap Initiative and a number of other groups have talked about this as the right-hand side, or type 2 translation in the so-called translational pipeline. It goes back to the idea that, oversimplifying to some extent, of course, we conduct basic science that produces new insights into physiology and other issues that allow us to identify potentially effective clinical interventions. The clinical research community takes those basic science findings, develops the clinical interventions, conducts the studies, when successful, moves them into the FDA approval process, and then publishes those findings and releases the new effective treatments. And those ideally would be adopted rapidly and appropriately, leading to improved health. And what the IOM Clinical Research Roundtable and a number of other groups have pointed out is that things aren't quite as rosy as this pipeline would suggest. We don't see the rapid transitions of ideas from basic science into clinical research, and we certainly don't see rapid transitions of ideas out of clinical research into practice and widespread adoption and uptake. Here's some of the key articles from the IOM Clinical Research Roundtable. It was actually established following a AAMC summit that was conducted back in 1999. At the bottom, I've indicated that within the UK and a number of other countries, there are similar reports that have been issued talking about the clinical research crisis and the fact that these transitions, the flow of ideas through the pipeline, the transitions are very slow, and that we have a relatively inefficient research system if our goal is to take advantage of, to capitalize on new ideas and innovations to improve health very rapidly. So again, we refer to these often as type 1 translation, type 2 translation. This slide very quickly is meant to indicate that many ideas that emerge from basic science or clinical research flow up into the, I suppose I should add, clouds or cobweb-filled bookshelves on the top of the slide to indicate that as a destination. Many times ideas are published, they sit on the shelves, they're not used, and oftentimes that's appropriate. Many basic science findings don't have any clinical application. What we're trying to do in terms of the NIH roadmap in improving efficiency and flow is to reduce these flows at the bottom. Ideas that emerge from basic science, and in the case of the implementation research community, ideas that emerge from clinical research that have value, that have utility, and that end up sitting on the shelf for 17 years before they're widely adopted. We'd like to eliminate those flows and overcome the so-called translational roadblocks. Implementation science is that second translational roadblock. Here's just another way of depicting those. The NIH roadmap, as you know, the CTSA program, for the most part, has focused in some universities exclusively on type 1 translation. There are a small number of us, and UCLA recently has joined the club. UC San Francisco, Washington University, St. Louis, there's a handful that do have a fair amount of investment in type 2 translation. But again, the CTSAs for the most part tend to focus on type 1. But this is what implementation research is all about within the pipeline concepts. So back in 2004, when we first got started planning a new journal in the field, based on the fact that VA researchers and others as well who were conducting implementation science had difficulty publishing our work in some of the existing journals and decided the new journal was needed. This was the definition of implementation science that we adapted from earlier published definitions. And it actually focuses on two different kinds of research activity. The first half of this definition focuses on sort of the policy practice relevant interventional sort of research activity. The field is all about trying to develop successful, effective strategies for accelerating appropriate implementation, for accelerating practice change. And the goal, of course, is to improve quality and outcomes. I've highlighted health services in blue in healthcare to indicate that this is actually not a definition of implementation science, but instead implementation science in health. There is implementation science activity in social welfare, criminal justice, civil justice, education, and a number of other fields as well. The second half of this definition emphasizes a slightly different sort of research activity that we might view as the basic science that underlies the more applied, intervention-oriented first half of the definition. The second half focuses on trying to understand healthcare professional behavior, organizational behavior, what are the factors that influence physician decisions, that influence rates of adoption. And that's a second focus of the field of implementation science, a second goal of the field. This slide basically says the same thing in a slightly different way. Three goals or three aims: developing reliable strategies for changing clinical practices, for accelerating adoption or implementation, improving quality, generating insights and knowledge about implementation processes. And then the third, as with any body of science, developing, testing, refining theories and hypotheses, methods and measures. If we were to take the last several dozen articles within the journal Implementation Science, most of them, if not all, could be classified into one or more of these categories. So again, this is another way of answering the question, what is implementation science? It's research activity that falls into these categories to achieve these aims. One important comment on the distinction between clinical effectiveness research and implementation research, because oftentimes there is a fair amount of confusion, and oftentimes, in fact, we conduct studies that include elements of clinical research and implementation. When we design and conduct an implementation study, we're focusing on implementation strategies that intend to change clinician practices, organizational practices. We measure those by examining rates of adoption, rates of adherence to protocols, rates of fidelity of delivery. We are ultimately interested in health outcomes, in reduction of symptoms, improvement of quality of life, and so on, but the proximal impact or effect of an implementation strategy is not patient outcome change. It's change in clinician behavior, clinician practices, healthcare delivery. Clinical research, of course, is different. It focuses on clinical interventions like drugs and procedures, and it does intend to improve directly symptoms, health outcomes, patient behavior. So this distinction is important, and again, as I said, oftentimes we conduct studies where we are interested in measuring not only changes in practice patterns, in adoption, implementation, or fidelity, we're also interested in understanding patient outcomes. And we do that primarily in situations where the outcomes are not necessarily a given. When we evaluate smoking cessation programs, for example, we measure those on the basis of smoking behavior, rates of smoking. We don't measure lung cancer incidence, and we certainly don't measure mortality. And the reason is, if we can succeed in changing patient smoking behavior, we know from a large body of prior research that we will see reductions in lung cancer and reductions in mortality. So the goal in smoking cessation is to change mortality to improve patient outcomes. But the proximal impact, the proximal effect is on behavior. It's a similar kind of situation with implementation. And oftentimes we see implementation studies where what is measured are patient outcomes. And when we don't see changes in patient outcomes, we don't know whether that's because the implementation strategy did not succeed in changing the practices, or whether we did succeed in changing practices, but all of the other factors that influence patient outcomes work to reduce the power, our ability to detect an effect. For those who are interested in further exploration, further work in implementation science, more reading, this is just a short list of some of the key resources. The next NIH conference, I believe it's the 8th, perhaps the 9th, on the science of dissemination implementation is coming up in December, 14th and 15th of December. There is a standing NIH grant funding announcement that cuts across many of the NIH institutes and centers. There's a standing study section. There are a number of training programs. Some of you have attended those. The journal Implementation Science that I helped to launch and a number of others focus on this field. We see a growing number of clinical journals that will have special issues from time to time focusing on implementation. I talked about some of the CTSAs, some of the ARC-funded PBRNs, the ARC Action Program, VA's Quality Enhancement Research Initiative or Query. These are some of the programs where we see implementation science activity. PCORI is moving in the direction of funding more of this work, although the legislation that established PCORI excuse me, actually assigns responsibility for implementation and dissemination to ARC rather than PCORI. So there's a little bit of uncertainty as to exactly who should be supporting this work and how. The AAMC has been promoting this field for a number of years. And then we have a number of programs up in Canada and the UK and elsewhere. So there is a fair amount of activity and there are a fair amount of resources for those who are interested in delving deeper and doing more in the field of implementation science. Within the health science campuses, these are some of the programs where we typically see implementation science activity. This is, by and large, a social science, behavioral science, rather than clinical science. So collaboration with some of the groups on the right-hand side is absolutely critical. But again, a fair amount of activity, and these are the places to begin your search in order to try to become more involved and begin to strengthen and expand implementation science activity within the health science campus. So let me shift gears again. Talk briefly on the concept of practice-focused research and some of the emerging models. And the question here is if we accept the argument that implementation science, improvement, delivery system science are all critically important, and they not only are important in the sense of developing better insights and building up a science, but in achieving some near-term improvements in the learning healthcare system, in strengthening healthcare delivery and improvement. How do we go about bridging the policy research gap? How do we go about developing studies and projects that will meet the needs of researchers who typically like to take 3 to 4 to 5 years to ensure high levels of internal validity and rigor and use sophisticated methods against the needs and preferences of the health system leaders who would like an answer yesterday or certainly by the end of the month. VA has struggled with this for a number of years, perhaps as long as any large system, going back to the 1990s, when VA, as you all know, went through a major transformation, and at the time was basically seeking support and involvement from any group of experts that were available. And so the story is that the head of the VA health system had dinner with the head of VA research and health services research and talked a bit about how to attract the interest and attention of the research community to focus on some of the practical problems of improving healthcare as opposed to the more long-term problems that much of the researchers were more interested in. And from that conversation and some notes on the back of a napkin emerged the blueprint for VA's Query program. Whether that story is true or not, there has been an ongoing effort to try to facilitate these kinds of partnerships where researchers are able to apply their tools, their approaches, their theories to conduct legitimate science-based research that meets the expectations of the funding committees, peer reviewers, and the journals, but that also has some near-term impacts and relevance for health systems. We see a growing number of academic health systems and medical schools that are setting up what I sometimes label 3I institutes. These are institutes for healthcare innovation or healthcare improvement or improvement in innovation. They all have some combination of center or institute and one or more of these 3 labels. Sometimes we see dissemination as well. And again, it's the same basic idea. How do we direct the energies and attention, the skills of the research community to the problems of our healthcare system and allow them to study and strengthen us in a way that yields benefits to patient care and efficiency and performance at the same time that it generates research output. Kaiser Permanente Southern California has what we call our Care Improvement Research Team. It, like the VA Query program, was initially funded with internal funds. It was an investment on the part of the health plan in the research community saying, we will provide this funding for you if you will agree not to spend all of your time chasing grants, but instead design projects with us that meet the needs of the health system leaders and clinicians in addition to the needs and preferences of the researchers, and we will work with you very closely. The Academy Delivery System Science Fellowship places researchers in similar settings, Geisinger, Intermountain among them, Group Health and others. Each of these programs shares one or more of the features that I've listed at the bottom. Critically important, of course, is joint governance. We have to have the health system leaders sitting at the same table as the researchers, prioritizing problems, deciding what to focus on and how to balance the need for academic rigor against the need for timely answers, how to balance the need for improvement and the desire to have all of the sites participate in the intervention arm as opposed to having half participate in a control arm, and all of the interest and work in designs such as interrupted time series, designs such as step wedge models. Those are all responses to some of these pressures and expectations. Internal funding is typically important, especially in the beginning, and again, the kinds of negotiations that I've alluded to over the scope, the goals, the standards for timeline and rigor. So again, a bit of a sidebar topic, but this is the direction that I think the country is moving in, and in the UK and elsewhere as well. The UK has its Clark program, a similar sort of effort that is designed to focus the energies and attention of the research community on day-to-day problems of healthcare delivery and improvement, in addition to all of the long-term research that we should continue to be doing, the basic science, the clinical studies that will eventually yield benefits. But the idea is to have more of a balanced portfolio. All right, I've talked a bit about implementation science. The quality chasm and quality improvement research, of course, is another important foundation for the learning healthcare delivery system. And because one of the areas of uncertainty and one of the most common questions that I and others encounter when we, for example, come as implementation scientists to the leaders of a health system to explain what we do and to offer our services, and to hear a response from health system leaders who essentially say, now I understand what implementation science is all about and what it is that you do. We have our own internal quality improvement shop. We've got that covered. Thank you very much. So the question is, what are the differences, if any? Are there some things that the implementation science community can contribute to the quality improvement or improvement science community? And are there ways for us to collaborate, perhaps in a manner that would yield benefits to all of the above? Not just having the implementation scientists strengthen the health system, but perhaps have the improvement scientists help the implementation science community to better achieve its goals. Again, when we talk about the history of this field, if we go back to the 1970s and 80s, most of the work in this area was labeled changing physician behavior. And many of the articles that were written at the time would open with a paragraph that talked about the fact that individual physicians are responsible for X percentage, 90%, 95% of all of the resource allocation decisions, decisions that affect quality of care and outcomes. And basically, if we're interested in improving quality, we need to understand how to change physician behavior. At some point, Don Berwick and others began to realize that the issue is not one of individual physicians, but systems, and that industrial quality improvement methods had some relevance and some utility in healthcare. So the body of research shifted into more of a quality improvement patient safety mode. At some point, for reasons that we still don't completely understand, implementation science became a popular label. One of the possibilities is that much of the research in quality improvement began to be much less scientific and much less research-like. And those who were trying to seek legitimacy and an equal standing with their colleagues in basic science and clinical decided that the term implementation science sounded a bit more scientific and rigorous. Be that as it may, much of the work is now conducted under this other label. I think it's fair to say that from this body of research, there are a number of very useful findings and insights, a number of recommendations. Many of them, though, are difficult to apply, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And it's also safe to say, I believe, and true, that VA, Kaiser, and many other systems have improved. We see much better rates of quality measured on the typical quality standards and metrics, but we also have a long way to go. The glass is probably not even yet half full. So the key question for those of us in the field is, what is it that we are doing? What could we be doing differently? How can we enhance our value and come closer to making the contributions that we would like to improve healthcare system performance? As an aside, again, those of you not familiar with the field, one of the problems with this still emerging, evolving field is the fact that it comes from a number of different foundations and sources, all of whom have their own labels. There's a bit of a debate within the field. Some of us would argue that let 1,000 flowers bloom. We shouldn't be trying to change these research traditions or force a number of research communities to change the labels they use. Others within the field, and I happen to be in this camp, are a little bit more concerned with how we look to the outside world. And for us to try to explain our role and our value and argue that we need more support, I think requires that we all become a bit more cohesive and describe our work under a single label so that it is easier to explain. But again, the point is that those who are interested in this field need to unfortunately become familiar with these different labels and what they mean. So a few quick comments on some of the differences between improvement science and implementation science. Quality improvement, for the most part, does tend to focus on immediate improvement needs. A quality improvement project will attack a specific quality problem, oftentimes using a rapid cycle iterative approach with the goal of changing practice and improving care for that particular site or that set of sites. On the other hand, implementation science often attempts to be more, in quotes, scientific and generalizable and to develop robust strategies similar to the way that we develop drugs. Ideally, our drugs are magic bullets that work for most patients under most circumstances. We don't always get there, and the concept of personalized medicine is moving us towards more of a mindset where we should be targeting individual drugs for individual patients and situations. But the point is that implementation science is a bit broader in its focus, and also tends to focus a bit more on understanding not just whether a strategy works or if it works, but instead how does it work. Understanding some of the underlying mediators and moderators and theories. Quality improvement tends to be much more pragmatic. We aim to change and improve quality. We don't necessarily aim to study it and understand why it worked. Some of the implementation science folks will essentially criticize quality improvement by describing a QI project as keep trying things until something works, and when it does, you're done. The implementation scientists, to be fair, are often criticized by the quality improvement community as having this naive view that they can somehow in advance predict exactly which implementation strategy and protocol will work. They will deploy that strategy in a set of a half a dozen sites with another half dozen as controls, walk away, set up some sort of monitoring and measurement, and come back 3 months later or 6 months later to see if it worked. In the same way that we study drugs. And that the quality improvement strategy of rapid cycle iterative improvement, where you don't put in place a fixed program hoping and praying that it works or believing that the theory that led you to that implementation strategy was effective and robust, but instead we need to continually measure and refine. These are some of the reasons why, in my view, these groups need to get together because they each have a different approach and a different type of understanding, both of which have some significant limitations, both of which have some significant value. And clearly, neither has made much headway in developing robust, effective strategies that work across numerous settings and problems. And so, again, we need to be looking elsewhere for solutions. Just a few more comments. Quality improvement often ignores contextual factors. They're not that relevant in understanding why something works. You just need to get to the point where the quality improvement program does work. But on the other hand, as I said, implementation science tends to have this idea that we can develop magic bullets. We can develop highly robust, effective implementation strategies that will be effective across a number of sites in a number of time periods and problems. And again, not much headway. Just a few more comments along basically the same lines, some of the differences and similarities between the two approaches. So bottom line, for these two fields in this particular theme or part of my talk, these are largely complementary fields. And for those of you interested in delving deeper into one or the other, my recommendation or plea would be to do both and not focus only on one or the other because there is a lot that needs to be learned from the two. Let me spend just a few minutes going through a couple of slides very quickly, talking about some of the key insights from implementation improvement science, talking again about why I believe they can support our goals for developing and managing successful, high-performing learning healthcare delivery systems, and then I'll wrap up with some comments that talk about some of the challenges we face and why it is that some of our approaches haven't been as successful as we might like. This slide summarizes a fair amount of research that basically explains why we often, more often than not, don't succeed with our implementation improvement programs. And the reason is captured by this color scheme that I'll explain. In order to see successful implementation, change in practice, we need to have a number of conditions present. Physicians we know, for the most part, will not implement clinical interventions and strategies without evidence demonstrating their effectiveness. This is coded in blue because we can sometimes generate evidence that shows something is effective, sometimes we can't. Clinicians also need evidence of deviations. Oftentimes we will present a set of physicians with a new clinical practice guideline and talk about the evidence base and the need for them to try to change their practice to follow that guideline. And the typical reaction is, yes, I'm familiar with that guideline, I agree with the evidence, and that's basically the way that I practice. It's only when we measure their practices and document deviations and show them that, yes, in some cases their patients are different and there are legitimate deviations, but by and large, many of the deviations are not appropriate and that they're in fact not following the guideline as often as possible. So this evidence of deviations is another necessary condition for achieving practice change. We need some form of external expectations and interest and pressure. It's not enough for a researcher to say, this is an important innovation or an important guideline, we think you should follow it. There has to be some other party. There are a lot of things that physicians know they should be doing, but they don't have time. And the problems that get their attention and where we do see more likelihood of change are those for which there are external incentives. In VA we have performance monitoring and incentives and a number of other strategies that help us to direct the energies and attention of the physicians towards quality goals. Supportive professional norms, the fact that the evidence suggests that a certain drug be used doesn't necessarily mean that the professional community, the physician community has accepted it. Oftentimes practices are driven not by evidence but instead by professional consensus. And again, we as researchers don't have any ability to change professional norms. We need opinion leaders and we need others to do that for us. We need to provide some etiology, some understanding of the logistical arrangements in place, why the practices are as they are, why they deviate from quality, what are the barriers, is it a matter of space, is there not enough time, do we not have appropriate staffing to make sure that all of the recommendations in an evidence-based guideline are followed. It may be that physicians accept the evidence, they know that they're not following the guideline, there's plenty of external pressure on them to follow the guideline, the professional norms are supportive, they just don't have the time. And no amount of CME or computerized reminders or financial incentives are likely to change that constraint. So understanding the causes of quality gaps and understanding what it is that's missing, what the barriers are, is one of the key first steps. The patient safety field refers to this as root cause analyses, conducting those analyses to understand what we need to change. Information evidence education, of course, are important. They are required, but they're nowhere near sufficient to achieve change. And of course, feasible methods and systems, that links back to my comments on item 5. We need to have the ability to set up staffing patterns and standard operating procedures and other logistical arrangements to allow for high quality care, to allow for the recommended practices to be delivered reliably. A slightly different set of insights and findings from this field, again, that show some of what the fields have to contribute to the goals of developing and managing a learning healthcare delivery system. Oftentimes, when we do see quality improvement success within a research framework, there's some reasons for that success that are not sustainable and are not scalable. When we have a grant-funded project that attempts to achieve improvement in quality in a half a dozen VA medical centers, and that project involves additional funding to support new staff and new services. That funding supports the research team that's on site every day or every week or every month, encouraging the physicians and the staff to do what we would like them to do. Oftentimes the research team recruits new staff, they hire, train, and supervise. And oftentimes it's simply a matter of the Hawthorne effect. If you have staff on site measuring your practices as part of a study, chances are, at least for that temporary period, you're likely to change your practices. These are not conditions that are sustainable and can't be replicated outside of the study. Once that study team goes away and the funds go away, you know the practices revert back to where they are. This is a list of some of the factors that research in this field has identified. This is a well-known list to most of you working in this field that we need to think about when we consider the prospects for scaling and spreading, implementing and spreading a new practice. We need to think about the features of the innovations and whether they are acceptable and whether they're compatible with current staffing and norms and so on. We need to understand the target adopters and whether they have the skill and the resources and the interest. The environment, is it conducive? Are there incentives or are there barriers? Do patients accept the new arrangements that we are trying to encourage physicians to deliver? Do we have innovation champions that are there to provide support and encouragement? And do we have specific strategies that will be effective? So again, as with my previous slides, one of the key findings from the implementation improvement science field is essentially these are complicated problems, and no single strategy or no single focus of attention is likely to achieve change. When we attempt to change practices, we need to have a set of essentially checklists sitting next to us so that we can walk through long lists of conditions that have to be in place, long lists of issues that we need to attend to in order to try to achieve the desired changes in practice. So just a few comments on this slide, and then I believe I have two more to wrap up. There are a number of published commentaries, for the most part, that have attempted to essentially diagnose and comment on the state of the science, the state of these fields. The problem is that many of their explanations tend to be contradictory. So in some cases, we have commentators who write about the fact that the implementation improvement science fields haven't made much progress because there's not enough internal validity. There are too few RCTs. On the other hand, others will comment on the fact that there are too many RCTs that are black box kinds of evaluation approaches, that those study designs are not appropriate for this set of phenomena. Some would argue that we don't have enough theory. Others would argue that we have too many theories. We just don't know how to use them, and so on and so on. The problem, the bottom line is, as with my comments on the previous slide, these are complicated problems. There are many factors we need to attend to. Some of you may be familiar with the distinction between simple versus complex versus wicked problems. These are definitely wicked problems. They're problems for which no amount of study is likely to give us the predictability and the insights and the ability to control the behaviors that we're trying to control. So rather than all of the explanations on the previous slide, the fundamental problem, in my view, and that of many others in the field, is that these phenomena are very different from the kind of clinical phenomena that we like to study, drugs and devices. Studying drugs is relatively simple from the perspective of the social scientists who study implementation and improvement. You have a drug, it comes from the factory in a very stable, fixed formulation. The drug looks the same, tastes the same, acts the same day after day, week after week. There are obviously genetic differences in others that cause differences in the way the drugs are metabolized, but for the most part there's much more stability and predictability. We deal with interventions, on the other hand, that are very heterogeneous and highly variable across time but also across place. The same intervention delivered to 5 sites is likely to be very different. The programs are also likely to be implemented differently across time and across place. The outcomes tend to be more highly influenced in many cases, not by the intervention, so the main effects tend to be weak. The outcomes tend to be influenced more by factors such as leadership and culture. So you could try 5 or 10 different implementation strategies or improvement strategies. If you're deploying those strategies in a clinic or a hospital with weak leadership, in a very problematic culture, and very limited staff support and resources and time, there's not likely to be much of anything that will lead to quality improvement. Those contextual factors are often critically important, and the influence of the contextual factors often dominates the main effect of the implementation strategy. Many of these have strong mediator effects. There's a very complicated causal chain that leads to the ultimate outcomes, and so on. So these are some of the challenges that we face in trying to study implementation and improvement, and therefore trying to generate effective guidance. To wrap up, one way of thinking about this is to think about two different kinds of questions. Clinical researchers ask the question, does drug X work? Is it effective? Or does drug X work better than drug Y? The question is, should it be approved by the FDA? Should it be included in our formulary? Even for an individual physician, that physician wants to know, is this drug effective for this patient? Should I prescribe it? And it's a yes-no question. It's either effective or it isn't. The question that we face in evaluating complex interventions like implementation and improvement programs is not, is it effective or not? Because the answer to that question is, it all depends. The question is not, does it work, but how does it work? Why and when? And where does it work? But also, how should I use it and how can I make it work in a sense? If you have the ability to modify an implementation strategy, unlike our ability to modify drugs, which we don't have, the guidance that we should be providing to our users is not which intervention strategy or implementation strategy to choose, but instead, how does it work and how can you make it work? And in some cases, how do you modify the organization to make the drug work or the implementation strategy work? The question again is how, when, and where does it work rather than does it work? So the contributions, again, of implementation improvement science to the goals of a learning healthcare delivery system, I believe, exist. They're relatively modest. The field itself, I believe, needs a fair amount of attention, methodologic development to deal with these kinds of complexities. So while it is a worthwhile goal, it's one that so far has eluded us, but I hope that some of these points provide at least some guidance for those of you interested. So let me stop now, take a few more sips of water, and manage to use up most of our time for Q&A, but perhaps there are a few minutes. And I am happy to stay afterwards for those. I know many of you probably need to leave at 5. Yes?
Do you have examples of studies that you think have been done correctly, that have been published in high impact journals that you could point us to as reference and sort of models?
If you give me about a month or so, I'll have an answer. And the reason I say that is the PCORI Methodology Committee has actually decided to tackle this problem, to try to provide some guidance, methods guidance for evaluating complex interventions. And that's one of the first questions. Who has done this properly? The general answer is those who have balanced internal and external validity, but also balanced a focus on impacts and outcomes with a focus on process. So not just randomizing, to condition A versus B and measuring outcomes at the end, but trying to trace what happens inside the black box. What are the causal mechanisms? What are the contextual factors? What are the mediators and moderators? There's some new guidance that was produced by the UK Medical Research Council on process evaluation, which is at least one body of methods for examining the causal processes, the mediators, the moderators, the mechanisms. And it does provide some guidance in the proper way to go about this. And there are some studies, some bodies of research that have been published across multiple articles. One presents the impact results, one presents some cost effectiveness data, one presents process evaluation results, one presents subgroup analyses. So it's that kind of package, that mix of analyses and reports that do represent in quotes the proper way to do this. But again, a stronger statement, I hope, will emerge from this PCORI effort. Yes?
Thank you for this nice review. I'm going to suggest a complementary approach that, together with this, would advance us directly. You've emphasized the centrality of the clinician decision maker. You've emphasized that the clinician decision maker is overburdened, doesn't have time.
Sure.
And you've emphasized the heterogeneity that results from judgment. And you didn't emphasize, but I think you'd agree, that the improvements in the VA and in Kaiser and other places are really important, but associated with compliance results that are embarrassingly low. So
Okay.
if you look at heart failure management,
Mhm.
the Fonoral's study of
Sure.
165 heart failure clinics. These are experts
Right.
now, not primary care physicians. I mean, the implementation of evidence-based therapies is staggeringly low.
Sure.
The range can go up to 95%, but it also includes 0.
Mhm.
So these are experts. So what I'm going to suggest is, since the physicians are overwhelmed, overburdened, have information overload, can't manage to do what they and other people want, providing tools that are detailed enough to be contextually responsive would enable them to replicate from one place to another the behavior, and that would be a huge advance. We already have evidence that that is achievable. It's not being pursued. Sounds like you may be in a position to think about changing that.
Yeah, and that, I think that is part of this concept of the high-performing learning healthcare delivery system. It gets to the issue of explicit management and careful study, rather than more of the laissez-faire, judgment-based approach. There is interest across many of the integrated delivery systems in this concept of the handbook, in thinking through in much more detail than I laid out in my early slides. What are the features and characteristics of a high-performing learning healthcare delivery system? And that kind of approach to try to provide some greater control, and standardization is not necessarily the right word, but more explicit management, I think, would be part of that concept. And there is, slowly developing interest. And there are many areas of care within Kaiser, Intermountain, Geisinger, where they have moved in this direction. But they tend to be very limited in scope. They will examine one domain of care, one service, one group of patients, and try to develop a more explicit set of care protocols and follow them. But
just to respond, I think it's important to distinguish between the details of the process, the business process strategy, and the details decision about what to do for her patient, because those are two different domains, and they're complementary, and they're both very useful, but they really are not substantive.
Sure.
And very little is being done in the expert domain, and I can tell you that I have failed to convince Intermountain that it's in their business interest to pursue this on a large scale, even though the feasibility is clearly established within that.
No, I think we need some demonstrations, and using that core analytic logic or decision support that does have these features, that is personalized and so on, and demonstrating that it's effective in certain areas may allow for a greater spread. Other questions, comments? I know it's now a few minutes after 5. I think we can wrap up, and again, if anyone is interested, I'll be here.